Hello Neverwinter. This video is the advanced layer of the Mad Dragon 45k item level challenge, which Gus live streamed last week. So if you want to see the full raw unedited footage, go and check out his channel. We initially were going to try and do this at 15k item level, but that was simply not possible. We initially thought that we may be able to get scaled up when we go in here, but that was not the case.
You are right, though. It's weird that there's no upside.
So, as you're probably aware, you cannot get into this dungeon at below 60k item level. So what we've had to do is zone in at 60 and then start taking things off until we get down to 45. The DPS are running without any equipment apart from their weapons, and the tank and the healer, myself and Zariel, we've got equipment on but pretty much nothing else except for a few companion enhancements. Obviously the main issue tank-wise is that we have a lot of unavoidable damage, and dropping our item level this low really kills our HP pool. We did wipe a few times on boss 2 and 3, so I've edited those out for brevity, but as I say, the entire stream failures and all is available on Gus's channel, although it's a pretty hefty one. 2.5 hours I think it took in the end, but a lot of that was some poor decisions were made on the second boss, and the last boss was just tough mechanics wise. It's worth noting that from a stat point of view, dropping the item level hasn't actually caused that many issues, because as I'm sure many people are aware, but for those who aren't, these dungeons run off the percentage value on your stats, and that percentage value can increase as you drop your item level. So the only sort of tangible effect really from dropping the item level is that I have less HP, and it's a bit harder to balance the stats. Okay, I'm going to do a little time skip magic to reduce the length of the video even more, and we'll pick back up going into the first boss. And it looks like even with the time skip this is going to take quite a while, so I will continue to explain some of the decisions here. Basically I'm just doing whatever I can to drop my item level to 45 or below, and like I say, the entire game stat wise is run off those percentages. You don't necessarily need all this fancy gear that I've got. There's a lot of other stuff that performs a similar function. And it's been my belief for a long time tanking that you value your stats over your HP. That's generally held true, although we're finally getting to a point in the game where we can maintain our stats as our item level increases, and that is giving us a great deal more HP to work with, which is quite nice. Obviously, as a tank, the greater your HP, the greater your stamina pool, which is effectively a second health bar when you're taking damage with your shield up. So there's definitely an argument for stacking HP, but you can stack as much HP as you like. If your stats aren't there, the HP is relatively useless. And here we go, first boss. I've done a couple of mechanics videos on this, and obviously it's with that knowledge of the mechanics that has allowed me to actually be able to do this at this item level.
This threat might get a little bit dicey.
If I was actually getting rhyme fire stacks or getting clipped by that blast, there's absolutely no way I would have survived this. We're also running with a pally. I don't think this would have been possible without those overshields. But who knows, maybe that's another challenge video we can do. And we are still suffering from the occasional bug with this boss, so results may vary, shall we say, when trying to do this. Put the Minotaur on here just for a bit of mob control. Minotaur being one of the best sort of mob controllers in the game at the minute. You just got to be careful on some dungeons because he can actually pull mobs into a position you don't want them in. Like on that second boss in here, for example, he can actually pull the dogs back in, pull the hounds back in when they're about to be pushed over the side. It's quite a powerful pull effect. So from a tanking perspective here, we're just maintaining aggro and obviously keeping the boss pointed away from the DPS. Like I say, I've got at least 2 mechanics videos for this. Those are generally, in fact no, those are the master variant, so
If you're going really slow, then it
they're a bit more intense, but with the way we've restricted the item level here, it's quite a similar experience actually, the damage wise. So it's those little red circles on the ground which cause the rhyme fire stacks, which cause quite a significant debuff, which causes you to take a lot more damage, which is why we're having to be sure to dodge them.
Sorry, I panicked.
Because obviously the main function for the healer here is going to be keeping the DPS alive. As a tank, you should be sort of capable of operating largely independent of the healer, unless there's some big damage mechanics going on. A lot of the more recent dungeons have been orchestrated, designed around damage avoidance rather than actual face tanking damage. Which is, it suits me fine because that's how I tank anyway, but it's taken a lot of tanks by surprise, unfortunately. We've got the KV on here. This is partly for aggro maintenance and partly for stamina regen. Your stamina regen's a lot faster when you've got KV active. Obviously from a fighter perspective, I'm not entirely sure how you'd do this on a pally or a barb. Barbs might have it okay actually, they got that rage. Got a lot of HP buffing abilities.
I'm scared of the second boss.
So we're staying pretty tight with her. If you look at my latest how to tank it deathless video, I explain there is a pattern to when these cone blasts come, which you don't notice when you're doing crazy damage because all of the mechanics tend to stack up. But the general thing is you'll get a sequence. Red circle, cone blast, red circle. Which holds true until the rails start coming. And then it's generally 2 rails before a cone. And I can just, I'll give you a little framework to work from. Obviously with how, I don't want to say, tight maybe, how tight the mechanics are. Especially with that cone blast, they've not given as much room for error or much room for the potential of there being lag on their side or our side, so that's why I'm always in motion here, because the game tends to think you're further back than you actually are, especially with that cone blast, so you kind of already need to be in motion when it hits. Obviously less of an issue with the advanced version of this because the damage is lower. But it's still worth learning the patterns and the mechanics. I think we were quite lucky on this that none of the imps got stuck in the chandelier. That would have made it incredibly difficult. And obviously due to me being quite squishy with the item level restriction we've applied to ourselves, I'm having to run away from these mobs quite a lot. Incidentally, that's why deflect is still quite useful. If you can get your deflect severity up as well, for these bosses where there's lots of mobs going on as well. Never known a lucky deflect's going to save your life.
Don't worry about me.
So you can see we're still doing a relatively decent amount of damage, even with the item level restriction. Obviously all the DPS have stripped off all their insignia bonuses as well, so they've got no tactician's precision to work with. Which is especially awkward for a ranger. I mean, they've got that mini daily, so they can proc that tactician's precisions like 4 times in a row. I've stated before, but as a tank, you don't really want to be running the aggro ring in here. Mostly because you don't want to end up pulling those imps on top of the boss, or pulling the imps into each other, because then they start doing that combined mechanic that they do when there's more than one up. Obviously, if the DPS are really struggling, you can go over and pick up the aggro for a little bit until they can take down the mobs, but generally you want to be able to control when you're getting dozens of mobs stacked on top of you. After the recent tweaks that they've made to this dungeon, this boss is actually a lot more difficult to move than she used to be. Hopefully they'll get that sorted. Oh, there we go. We did end up with 1 imp in the chandelier. That is a massive problem that they need to fix. I don't even know how they've ended up there. There used to be some weird interaction between a wizard daily and a rogue daily that we could see rogues get pushed onto the ceiling. But obviously we've got no wizards and no rogues here. If you notice, we're occupying a pretty set semicircle. That's just so the DPS have a nice wide range of area they can stay in without having to worry about that blast coming in and hitting them. Obviously we need to adjust as the DPS are moving around trying to kill these mobs. And that that one can be a real killer if you get charmed by the succubus incubus. So we just had a couple of rails, there should be a cone blast coming soon. Got a little bit frantic at this point. And I don't know whether it was a design decision on the part of the devs, but for some reason, whatever they've done to the graphics has made these reds a lot less visible against the ground than they used to be. They used to be quite bright. I don't know, maybe it's a contrast setting of mine, but it does seem to be a bit of an issue, especially in Master Tiamat and such. And Master Zariel for that matter, or any version of Zariel. Any of the ground effects seem to be, well, stuff like the Warlock's circle heals and stuff seem to get buried underneath the platform so you can't actually see them. You see that artifact going off, the Beacon and Meteor Swarm is incredibly good for this dungeon. It's AoE debuff that also stuns. So if you stick that on a pack of mobs, you can give yourself a bit of breathing room between the stun and obviously the mobs dying faster. So, for those who don't know, the Hellfire Imp increases the damage of the mobs it's connected to. And the Rhymefire Imp heals the mobs. And then if the Rhymefire Imp and the Hellfire Imp meet up with each other, they start doing a sort of white noise blast, which does a ridiculous amount of damage. That's why we make sure we take those imps down quickly. And, if you see the way I'm moving here, this is why I say that movement speed is probably one of the most powerful stats in the game. The amount of damage you can avoid if you're just fast enough is quite significant.
I hope to this grove one day. Yeah. Hey, I'm deathless.
God, I don't remember this feeling like it took this long when I was actually doing it. Jeez. There we go, another extremely long first boss.
That's how you do it, definitely.
And I'll do another little time warp to get us to the second boss a bit quicker. We're picking back up here after we wiped a few times on the second boss. We did nearly complete it on the first attempt, but we got a little bit cocky and tried to do a burn from 10%, which obviously we're 15k item level under the recommended for the dungeon, and none of the DPS have any equipment on, so it didn't work. I mean, we got pretty close, but it was not to be. Obviously my biggest concern about attempting this was this particular boss with that big
He's gone in a weird
hit that he
position.
does. But to be honest, the amount of damage he's doing is equivalent to what I would expect him to do in Master, so it wasn't all that different. You may notice there that we've swapped one of our encounter powers. This is one that I think is probably quite underutilised on the fighter. The ability to just regen your stamina like that is incredibly useful, especially for bosses like this one. Iron Warrior as well, that's one that may go somewhat underutilised. So the biggest issue we have on the dwarf with this boss, and I don't know if it's specifically a dwarf issue, but every time we use Brazen Slash we will get pulled in towards the boss, and this boss is so ridiculously overtuned for movement that the slightest movement will cause him to just completely reposition himself, which can result in some very unpredictable behaviour and a lot of pissed off DPS as they get continually wiped by that massive hammer blast. So if any of the devs are watching this, if you could fix that up, it'd be much appreciated. So what we kind of had to resort to doing, or what I've had to resort to doing, is simply dropping my shield in between the big hits and relying on the healer to keep me up as my stamina regens.
Starts off at 5.
Obviously in between using the stamina recovery encounters, and then occasionally tap in
It's not that easy.
Iron Warrior just to reduce the overall damage. Since we're running with 3 rangers, we don't actually have any like wizards to push. That means we don't need to position the boss towards the edge
Nice.
to make those hounds easier to push off. And it gives us a bit more flexibility with the positioning. As you can see though, I honestly don't know what they have done with the movement on this boss.
I'm not moving him, man. He's doing whatever
And
he
stand
wants.
perfectly still and he will just start moving around. It's clearly accounting for the mobs that he spawns, and then he seems to be accounting for player positioning and companion positioning. It's really bizarre behaviour. We're running the Riotous Orothe here as well. It's just a nice damage resistance even after the nerf that they gave it. once you've established aggro here as a tank, it's just a case of kind of maintaining it, trying to make sure the boss doesn't skits out and start doing its crazy movement dance. And then when it's safe to do so, throw out your artifact and mount power. The most important thing for completing this sort of safely is having a lot of stun stacked up. The summoners are susceptible to stuns and interrupts, so if you can keep those sort of chaining on them, it prevents them from summoning the hounds. And it's the hounds that cause the issue. Get too many of them stacked up, you start getting red blasts going off at unpredictable times. Oh yeah. As well as obviously the increased damage or stamina loss on the tank. Range of the new meta, right? Once we hit 50%, it gets a bit more difficult. But these guys are doing a good job. When we are repositioning him, we're doing small movements where possible to avoid him getting too erratic. And obviously we are kind of relying on the DPS here to do their part effectively. The rangers actually have I think it's a class feature or a feat, which allows their roots to apply a stun. So if you happen to have a ranger in the group and they run that, it's incredibly useful. It can get a bit awkward with this boss when he gets into a sequence like that, where he's summoning the summoner and the warlock as that red is popping. So if you notice there, I just used the AoE stun daily that the fighter has. That can be quite useful. It'll stun the summoners, stun the mobs. If you time it right, you can just give the DPS an extra few seconds to get onto the second summoner. Obviously, one summoner and one warlock will spawn to the right and the left of you. So if you get it timed nicely, you can just delay that hound spawn by 3 or 4 seconds, which is hopefully enough time for the DPS to get on there and start stunning them themselves. Again, I'm not entirely sure this would have been possible without the shielding of the pally at this item level. But maybe that's a challenge video for another day. There are certain mechanics this boss does where you can turn the way he's facing so that he doesn't auto-correct. Like this one, for example. When you get sort of movement locked, you can change the way that he's facing. It's a bit risky because he is very unpredictable. But it's something to be aware of. One thing I did notice doing this was that his movement is a bit more consistent if you use your tab shield, your R3 shield. No, that's something that's going to bear more testing. Once we get down to 20%, it gets a bit more frantic. But we're just going through the motions here. We're not looking for any massive articles to finish him off. And if you are the tank, like I did there, you just want to delay your article onto that second summoner until the DPS are ready to pick him up. And if you can, try to avoid picking up the aggro from the hounds if they do spawn. Much easier to deal with if the DPS can sort of root them or stun them away from the boss. And you can maintain a safe area around the boss. Or well, as safe as it can be. And if you see, we're just raising the dig-in at the final second or so to maximise our stamina regen. And throwing in those retaliates as often as we can to maintain that aggro. Obviously the other issue with moving that boss besides him occasionally deciding to slam his hammer into the DPS is that if you move him too far, he'll start popping those, I don't even know what they're called, those red circles, those hellfire rings. Those spawn due to group proximity to the boss, so if you get too far away from him, those start popping up. So if the tank pulls the boss all the way away from the DPS, they can get a nasty surprise with one of those forming under them. I'm not really a fan of this passive tank in the way that we've had to do it. Much more prefer to be going in there, hitting them with a threatening rush and brazen slash and all sorts. But we're kind of having to work to the quirks of the dungeon, unfortunately. See here, we do the AoE stun. Throw our mountain daily. We can minimise those hounds spawning. do very small movements to tweak the position of the boss. I'm not sure if that hammer can actually be deflected, because it's definitely hit me a few times without the shield up, and it seemed to do not a great deal of damage. I don't know if I just got lucky with the deflection, or it's I've somehow managed to dodge out of it. Difficult to tell in here. And then we're taking it very slow, as you can see. The reason for this is that when he gets locked into that push and then in mechanic, he can't summon anything within that window, which is what gives us the opportunity to burn a bit. Like so, everyone pops their eyes. And then a nice bit of burn to finish him off without having to deal with the final summoner wave. Okay, we'll do another little time warp and meet up at the last boss. Last boss was another one that we had a few wipes on. Partly due to bad mechanic execution, and partly due to it just being incredibly unpredictable. And I think the first couple of times I forgot to put on the scroll of protection from dragon, which certainly didn't help. I have put up a mechanics video for doing this in the master version, but the same holds true for this version, even if it's a bit less damage for this version. So I put 2 hard taunts on here. This is because KV will not reach usually without putting the DPS in some pretty dangerous positions, and you do not want the DPS in your KV when that dragon hits, because if it hits both of you, you get your damage plus the DPS damage.
Candles again, in between.
And the DPS damage comes through as like raw damage, so it doesn't get affected by your defensive stats. Basically just a massive chunk of HP off. And the way we've had to do this, due to again the lower item level, especially on the tank, with significantly less HP than I usually run with, is basically avoid getting hit by any of these debuffs, or get as few debuffs as possible. The debuff that seems to cause the biggest issue is that one that comes from the breath. It's one of the green debuffs that seems to really mess up your damage resistance. And I've already said in obviously the previous mechanics video, but these candles are always preceded by those little poison circles, and then afterwards there is usually a breath. So as soon as those poison circles pop up, you can kind of predict what the sequence is going to be, at least up until 50%, 20%. It usually goes
poison followed by candles,
red blast, poison circles, candles.
Watch out for breath.
And unless it's a fully fully outer ring sort of set of candles where nowhere is safe. You're usually either safe on a point or in the center of one of the straight lines. Obviously, if you start moving or being aware of where you are when those poison circles pop up, you can then
in between.
predict where a safe spot's going to be.
Watch your breath.
And then if you're aware that the breath blast can follow on from that, you can start making sure the dragon's positioned and you're positioned.
Very little move.
That flip he does is generally followed by a breath blast. So as soon as he starts trying to flip over you,
very minimal control.
You need to run back through him and make sure he's pointed away from the DPS.
So it's what I'm trying to do.
And I'm not sure if it's a
my control to do it.
dwarf character model specific thing, but certainly on the dwarf you can run into his character model to avoid the breath.
In.
Sort of run between his legs.
Watch your breath.
When you have to move to the centre like this, it's worthwhile just doing a little bit of an extra movement so that you can pull him horizontal across your line instead of pointing towards the DPS. And when you are moving after this poison thing, he's going to try and do a ground attack a lot of the time that will stun you. So it's worthwhile using your tab shield to move during that sequence of events to prevent that stun from hitting. I mean, besides that, this is a relatively boring boss, unfortunately. Seems to be having a lot of trouble recently creating interesting mechanics.
Let's go.
As for the articles, you want to be doing the articles after a sort of sequence of candles. So poison, candle, breath, eyes. If possible, arties whilst he's doing the breath, because he gets locked into that mechanic. And it's a good bit of safe time where you can do damage without worrying too much about it.
In between. Watch for breath. Poison on the ground.
This poison floor is the
possibly with breath as well.
Worst goddamn mechanic of this boss. There's just a lot of luck involved.
Really shitty mechanic.
Even as a tank, you're going to be struggling to survive if you're actually on that poison. And he generally follows it up with a breath, which is what causes the biggest debuff issue. So just one sort of ground poison sequence followed by a breath can just debuff you so hard that you can't survive. It's not a good mechanic. As you can see, we managed not to pick up any of those green debuffs so far, which is why our damage resistance is still pretty high. The other debuff stacks do not cause as much of an issue. Obviously you get enough of them, they will start to cause an issue, but nowhere near as significant as that green one.
Watch for a breath.
And obviously with this breath, you can't really outpace it, but you can break the line. If you're more towards the side of him, you've got more chance of dodging the damage from that.
Candles. In between. Watch your breath.
Once he gets past 50%, he does a sort of pull mechanic as well. That can be a bit dangerous. You can get pulled into the candles if those two sequences line up.
Followed by poison.
I really don't know what they were thinking when they coded the movement for this one as well. Doesn't seem reasonable that a dragon can just walk straight through you, or you can walk straight through a dragon, but who knows. Like so, we just found a safe spot in the poison cloud inside the dragon model. And unfortunately we then get that breath on top of us. And we're quite lucky we didn't get a load of those particularly dangerous debuff stacks.
Followed by candles. In.
And as I stated in that mechanics video, you can use the geometric nature of this hexagon to identify where a safe spot will be, depending on the relative position of the candle spawns.
You can get poison and candles out.
Now, I don't usually advocate for the
We're gonna get double
tab shield on a fighter since we got the dig in, but it can be very useful for just avoiding control effects as you're moving around, especially for this particular boss. See, now that we're down to 20%, that white noise starts kicking in. Which still feels like it does a obscene amount of damage.
Poison and then candles.
But that might just be the effects of the debuffs rather than...
Watch out for breath.
the actual mechanic itself. Although it does do a really nasty sort of 1-2 tap, as we'll see in a minute, I think, where he follows a white noise up with a big swipe. It's a real dick move that's quite hard to predict.
Okay, we'll go through a cycle. Poison, followed by candles. In between.
There it is. I don't know, maybe it's because I got caught by the candle beforehand.
Yeah.
So we're noting there, although we are like
candles.
putting ourselves down to 45k here, for this advanced dungeon you will get scaled down, even though you don't get scaled up if you are above the item level. And that's where it's very important that you get your percentages right on your stats, because that's what they're looking at when they're doing the scaling.
Candles. Out. Might get breath.
And there's the danger of the pull, getting pulled into a candle.
Oh, he's going to do breath.
This all just gets highly erratic in the last 20%. And a nice little article to finish it off. There we go. Extremely long video. 45k challenge run. If you like this video, please leave a like. If you like a lot of videos, please subscribe. Big thank you to the team. Zariel, Azapeng, Gus
Another tank
and
kill.
Eileen,
Of course.
all very good players. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you on the
Nice
next
one,
one.
guys.